Thank you, Francesco. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, and thank you for the History Center for hosting me. I'm delighted to squeeze this in on such a cold and blustery night. So thank you for coming and thank you for your time. I was upstairs and you need some better insulation in this building. I mean, it was freezing next to that window. But historic preservation and buildings that have a connection to the past are certainly one of the many characteristics that are making smaller towns more viable than they were even just a few years ago. And I want to start by talking about a small town in southwestern Ohio called Piqua, almost exactly the same size as Sudbury, by the way, which also has a very robust trail network. And I saw this book in the gift shop about the trail guide in and around here. That is another characteristic of smaller towns that are more alluring than they had been in the past about making transportation networks function in different ways. Piqua was actually at the intersection of multiple crossroads in its history. And like a lot of towns in the Midwest, in the mid to early 19th century, two canals sliced their way through the state of Ohio, connecting Lake Erie to the Ohio River to the south. And these canals provided the transportation network and the commerce network that really helped the continent grow. And these pictures sort of show how that infrastructure in many ways was forgotten over time. This image, which was kind of right around the post-war era, shows how the forgotten infrastructure actually is no longer even present in this town of 20,000 people. And in Piqua, these tow paths paralleled the river typically, but because the town grew up on an oxbow, you can see the river sort of winding its way around. They actually took the canal straight through the town in order to sort of save on the engineering feat of running across a much larger geography. And no sooner had the canals been completed than they were usurped by another mode of transportation, right? You can see in the foreground the railroads, which 50 years later would become usurped once again by the highways on the periphery, which made smaller towns like this a little bit less viable in the past. By the way, Piqua, the Dayton area, is also where the Wright brothers were born. And so this has always been a town at the crossroads at intersections. A massive flood in 1913 required the local Corps of Engineers, the Miami Conservancy District, to build a large revetment wall that paralleled along the river, both protecting it but also then cutting it off from this transportation network of the river. Many American cities and towns experienced the same thing. I was just in Dubuque, Iowa yesterday. It's the Great Mississippi, but boy, you can't even see it from most places in the downtown. So most communities actually just demolished the canal network when they no longer became viable, but in Piqua they simply buried it. And today, the town is unearthing the lock and the canal system to forge a better connection to the trail network that runs along the Great Miami River. Our office was fortunate to work here over the course of the last 10 years. And so we didn't even know that the lock was there when we were developing this riverfront plan. And it was the local historian who scolded us at a planning board hearing when we were trying to recreate this water, this canal wall. And he said, why don't you just excavate it? They simply buried it. And so today, this forgotten infrastructure is actually creating a much stronger sense of place and connection in this small town. It's a 3.5-acre park that serves as the trailhead to 330 miles of continuous trails. And so what you're seeing here is actually the terracing back of the levee wall so that it allows the area to flood when that happens, but it also increases the capacity of the river at its bend, so it actually becomes more resilient. And now a person can actually see the river from the downtown. Many of these canal networks, because it would take 10 to 15 minutes on the canal boat to in the lock to make that change in grade. Oftentimes what emerged was brew pubs and hotels along their length. And so it's not just about exposing this, this connective tissue, but it's about revitalizing the buildings that lie along its length. And so the design intervention actually tries to balance flood protection with promotion and extension of the trail network. And so what you're seeing here is actually in the crosshatch, if you can see from a distance, that area was excavated, thereby allowing the lock to become more visible along its length and then forging that connection. The rail bridge in this cross-section is in the background. So the design is about making the flood control compatible with an urbanist agenda. And here, this is just from last summer. Small town, big project. And it's interesting that in smaller municipalities, sometimes more can get done because the networks and the relationships are so much stronger. I'm assuming most of you are here from Sudbury, and I feel like I'm singing to the choir, right? Because this is a very similar sized municipality on the periphery of a major urban center. That would be Boston. And this is kind of a big deal for their downtown. The project emerged through a downtown plan, and we sought to forge connections between destinations in the downtown, with the Lock 9 Park being right here. We're architects and planners, and so we were able to design the lock, the park. Here you're seeing the lock being excavated. And it really, the project repositions the river as the center of life. I came here a few hours ago. Actually, I've never been here before. I passed a waterway. I'm pretty sure I crossed what was once a rail line. It looked like on the old Connecticut Road. It looked like a trail now. You've got remarkable buildings. There's a lot going on in just this little town center that I passed through. The projects, Francisco mentioned the book about rebuilding the American town. It's also about rebuilding confidence in what's happening in smaller municipalities across the USA and what it takes to make these things happen financially, economically, socially, cobbling together the resources necessary, particularly in a moment of fiscal austerity across the country, when there's often a reluctance to spend public resources on public realm or infrastructure or transportation, things that are absolutely essential to allowing a place to grow and to thrive. We were fortunate to, most of our clients are cities or towns, public sector. We were fortunate to then reuse the building next to it, which was, they sold tombstones for a long time. Before that was a Harley Davidson dealership, and now it's a brew pub. Once again, when we look back at the old Sanborn maps, of course, there was a brewery there in the 1840s, and so a building uses change, but the form can endure. You know, this building has lived multiple lives, and I think that there's a mounting appreciation for adaptive reuse and historic preservation, as evidenced by this building or that. The project also kind of recognizes that to get things done, the projects have to be right-sized to their populations and being realistic about what can be achieved. The project fell on the heels of this book, which came out in 2016. Patty Hayda teaches urban designers about planning at Washington University in St. Louis. She was my co-author. I tend to work mostly with planners, helping to think about the spatial implications of the things that they plan. And the book was sort of striving to make more visible the processes that are often opaque in getting projects done. It's both a celebration of what's working, but also a recognition that there continue to be challenges really across all kinds of cities or towns, and what exactly allows them to progress. Does anyone know where this image was taken? Any guesses?
Portland.
How do you know that?
I thought they had a cable car and it's foggy.
Yes, great. This is the Portland South Waterfront, yes, which is a kind of a remarkable case in the city's book, and we we chose it in part because the processes of getting things done are often seem like they're somewhat foggy. And we also love to travel, and so oftentimes students will ask, show me a good example of an instance where a bus rapid transit line has catalyzed redevelopment. That might be a good question for your thesis, right? And I'd say the health line in Cleveland is probably a pretty good example of something like that. So the book, because I do have a foot in academia and practice, it's also a way to just see what else is happening across the country. And the Rebuilding the American Town book then is looking at 9 municipalities of 50,000 people or less. That was the criterion that oftentimes the census uses about what defines a town. And even in Massachusetts, it's confusing to me about what's a town and what's a city. I live in Watertown. They're now a city. They were a town, the same size. I get confused. I don't know. Maybe you can help me figure it out.
If you have a mayor or not.
As if you have a mayor or not. It's that simple.
Yeah, it's basically what targeting that mayor or town meeting.
Thank you. Now I know. I'm not here trying to pimp the first book, but I do want to say that the way that we organized Rebuilding the American City was by typologies. Like, the first category of these 3 cities, Buffalo, Philadelphia, and New Orleans, was an instance where an institution has been a catalyst for redevelopment. The second series, the second row, Chattanooga, Green Bay, New York, riverfronts. The middle category was about historic preservation. Atlanta, Birmingham, and Houston is basically park systems that are creating revitalization. And the last categories was about really transit that's allowing these projects to move forward. And they provide ample evidence against the frequent lament that American planning and urban design are reactive, conservative, and therefore provide insufficient leadership to actually get stuff done. If you travel to other countries and you see what they're doing and you sort of lament the fact that, well, we don't have that level of, let's say, public realm or superlative design excellence, there actually is a lot happening. You just sometimes have to look a little bit closer that makes the American cities unique. And one of the conditions that make that less possible to understand is that oftentimes redevelopment is happening against a backdrop of disinvestment, whereby the kind of where the growth is happening is oftentimes directly adjacent to areas that are languishing. And some of the most interesting areas where revitalization is taking place are occurring in these residual zones where industry once flourished. In Houston, the Buffalo Bayou, was really a sewer for decades, but through the concerted advocacy of a lot of small groups of civic-minded people, they have transformed that into a major corridor. The Atlanta Beltline, have any of you been there?
I lived on it.
You lived on the Atlanta Beltline.
Yes.
Can you describe for your friends what that was?
It's basically something like a 35-mile loop around the city. And the first section to be redeveloped was where I lived on the east side, just a couple miles from downtown. And, it's a spectacular place to walk. I mean, this describes Atlanta, because people would drive 20 miles to park and then walk up.
That's exactly right, yeah. And it's the poster child for
But, I lived
traffic
in a
congestion.
townhouse near there, next to it, and rode my bike every night, and great restaurants and bars, and kind of cool. It's extending.
You're exactly right. 35 continuous miles, basically an old freight line that circumnavigates the downtown. Here's the Portland South Waterfront. Still a working waterfront, fairly recently. Oops, we lost that. There's a mounting appreciation for older buildings. And have any of you been to Louisville, Kentucky? Yes, sir. A couple of people, they now have Bourbonism, which is like a major tourism in Bourbon. But in Louisville, it was really about their Main Street, which had the highest concentration of cast iron buildings outside of New York City. And that was a photo from the really mid-'80s, about to be demolished. And through, again, the concerted efforts of a lot of different people, preserving them and incrementally making investments in the streetscape that allow developers the opportunity to see more potential along just their main street. It's less than a mile from one end to the other. And now there's over 13 museums and cultural institutions along that length. In Buffalo, New York, I've spent 20 years trying to get a medical campus to think more collectively and to find ways to kind of create a stronger sense of place. And this is just along the medical campus in Buffalo. I'm from the Midwest originally, and people think about the Rust Belt, which is, I don't think it's the right term anymore. In fact, people are talking about the legacy cities because the infrastructure there is so robust. And Buffalo is capitalizing on what makes it unique. It's got strong neighborhoods, it's got institutions, it's got the waterfront. The Great Lakes will be the savior to that region when it's 120 in Phoenix, which it often is. And so finding ways to capitalize on what makes you unique and kind of overcoming the barriers of redevelopment.
And it's got the silos.
It does. Buffalo has the silos. That's right. The grain silos along the Niagara River. So the city's book in 2016 followed on the town's book in 2024, and I'm currently conducting research about what's making regions unique. And I'm just curious, before I jump into towns, what might be some cases or some thinking around regions that would make them worthy of celebration in the United States? Any guesses? Like, what would the topics be even?
Buffalo history.
History?
You've got the Erie Canal, which there is a revitalization going on.
That's
and it's Buffalo to, I forget, outside New York.
The Empire State Trail is 330 miles, goes from New York City to through Albany. Yep, and then over to Erie, Pennsylvania. Yep, and Buffalo.
They're rebuilding it.
They are. This is one of the canals, right? So recreation trails, mobility is definitely a topic. You mentioned history. How would that apply at a regional scale?
Well, I know, well, they were bringing a lot of tourists. I don't know, it has anything to
Okay.
do with it.
Hampshire and Franklin counties are an interesting region, but it's tough for me to define what the defining essence is other than a bunch of hippies that got there in the 60s. Change with the time.
And it's hard to define what a region is. Even towns was a little bit elusive, but well, the topics that are sort of emerging deal with the environment, with energy, and with mobility and migration. I think those will be the topics. But like any good faculty member, I didn't think of these myself. I taught a class this semester where I had 5 very smart, ambitious master's and even PhD students take that on. So Edmund looked at the Sunzia wind farm connecting New Mexico and Phoenix to where the winds are the highest, and he compared that with New England wind, or you might think of it as Cape wind. The Bright Line in Florida and California was what Nathan was looking at. Samuel actually started with the region, Appalachia. What's happening in post-coal Appalachia? Some pretty interesting things. There's the Industrial Heartland Trail that Rhoda studied, and Tatiana was also looking at the removal of the dams in northwest United States, the Klamath River dam removal, which has finally allowed the salmon to spawn. And so, again, a very strong environmental overlay. So that was a big wind-up to talk about why you're here, but thinking across scales is something that I think is like an important characteristic of a designer and a planner. And so if the cities were organized by paradigms, we created different topics for the towns. And these were the 9 different towns. We intentionally strive to get a range of types of cities and towns, geographic dispersion. About 2/3 of every case are essentially interviews with people who are instrumental in the project's implementation. And we span from developers, civic leaders, activists, detractors, community members, politicians, We got some governors and senators. The towns then, if you can see, is the light orange. 9 different towns, again, thinking about what their stories are and what makes them unique. And then the regions, this is, again, just scratching the surface, but depending upon who you ask or what you read, there may be 11 to 13 kind of cohesive or somewhat cohesive regions in the United States. And it partly deals with watersheds, the Colorado River going through 9 states, 20% of the fresh water in the world in the Great Lakes. That matters a lot. The transportation network. You know, I saw photos here of the railroads and what Amtrak is trying to do and how hard it is with freight, sharing lines with freight rail, and yet we're privileged in the Northeast Corridor to at least have the opportunity to get down to New York or DC or Richmond on I wouldn't say high-speed rail, but certainly on a rail line. So our research looks at these different towns and is trying to, again, talk about what's happening that's interesting, but also what are the barriers. And so I'm just curious, again, to ask you a question. What do you think, what's the confluence of issues that might make a smaller town more viable than in the past? Affordability, absolutely.
A reason for city slickers to visit.
Tourism, okay. So particularly,
Mass Mocha and the Bentonville Museum would be great examples.
okay, so how many of you have been to Mass Mocha? Raise your hand. In North Adams? Over about half of you, okay. What else?
Well, it seems to me communication's so good now that you can live here and work there without going there.
So the rise of remote work.
Sure.
Absolutely. Half my friends from Brooklyn now live in Poughkeepsie, it seems like, because they can. What else?
Families looking for quality, yards to play in, schools.
So I would break that down into 2 things. Access to open space and kind of familial networks that are tighter. Historic preservation, walkability. Those are definitely drivers. Particularly, I think, in this moment of somewhat political crisis, where there's this fictionalized nostalgia about small towns maybe being secure and safe, which isn't necessarily the case, but there is a slight polarization, I think, about what a small town life means. And depending upon what news channel you watch, one might think that the cities, the urban centers, are rife with distress, whereas a small town is somehow more safer. And it's actually not that black and white, of course. So these are the distribution of the towns and the cities. And we also strive to get a range of different types of towns. So Bentonville, Arkansas, actually, in the 4 years of writing the book, actually eclipsed one of our criterion for small towns. It's now 60,000 people. It's probably 64,000 now. And what's in Bentonville that you might? Walmart. The headquarters of Walmart. And if you do business with Walmart at a certain scale, you actually are required to have a presence in that city, in that town. It's now a city, I would say, which is changing the dynamic of Northwest Arkansas. That's how it's branded, NWA. But rather than thinking about these as I initially imagined, which is, I mean, this could be called a colonial town. There are college towns. There are ghost towns. There are river towns, right? Rather than thinking of it in that way, we actually categorize them by relationship to other things, by relationship to urban centers. So constellations, small towns that actually work together with other small towns to leverage their strengths. Satellites, towns that are kind of near an urban center but separate. Metroposts are small towns that are actually part of an urban center. I don't know which one Sudbury would be characteristically. Or an outpost, which is a small town far away from anything else. And because this started pre-COVID and then sort of went through COVID, it's just really interesting about this nostalgia that we have as a culture about small towns and main streets in particular. And in the book, The Death and Life of Main Street, Miles Orville talks about the fact that the underlying power of small towns is both social and emotional. And that there's this kind of vision, whether I just saw It's a Wonderful Life, might be a good example of that, or certainly Disneyland when people think about, well, that's what we mean when we talk about small towns. But my niece, who's 24, says, well, Uncle David, where's the diversity? Where's the transit? Where are the jobs? Like, what are the jobs in these small towns? So there's this kind of tension, I think, that towns may paradoxically perpetuate a greater sense of individualism and undermine inclusion simply because they are somewhat separate. And that's kind of flying in the face of this nostalgia that we have as a culture about them as being kind of homogeneous and safe and perpetuating family values and even Americanism. So I think it's in some ways that rhetoric or that narrative has been amplified over time. So I'm going to walk through a couple of these, and the first one is, in fact, North Adams. The reuse of, this is the third life of this immense factory complex. I always wondered how in the world would one of the largest contemporary art museums in the country be located 3 hours from a major urban center. And well, it was the Arnold Print Works before it was an art museum, and after it was the Arnold Print Works, it was Sprague Electric, which had created transistors in the mid-1900s. It's evolved over time. In a region that is actually very picturesque, surrounded by Jacob's Pillow and Tanglewood and the Clark and Williams College. It's actually working together with these other towns. That's what makes it a constellation. The case, however, is not simply about the reuse of this older building into an art center. It's actually about the promise, maybe even the unfulfilled promise of an institution to catalyze its downtown. In this image, we always have a 3D view. There's a big part of urban renewal that decimated part of the downtown. So the aspiration for this as a project, as an economic development project, sponsored by the state and Governor Dukakis at the time, was to catalyze the downtown. But if you've been there recently, you may go to the museum and museums try to keep you inside for as long as they can. And by the way, maybe you can meander out and have a good meal, but it hasn't yet achieved, I think, its initial promise. And so while as remarkable as it is, the downtown is still languishing. And they've done a lot to try to change that. They have created a new wayfinding and branding system with lots of signs. They now give you pamphlets at the parking lot about restaurants to visit. This is the big bling that a major artist put on the other side of the highway to try to encourage people to go out into the downtown. In fact, they've created an art walk, which is this red line that brings together multiple artists over time. And here's Jack Wadsworth, who was one of the main philanthropic donors there. He was a former alum of Williams College, and then Governor Dukakis. So what's interesting is that but for Mass MoCA, I don't know what would have happened in downtown North Adams, because it's so far removed from the major urban center. But because of the ability to work remotely, because of the relationship to these other destinations, because of the Berkshires even, it has become a lot more than it has previously, and they are working to now remove that highway that cuts off the downtown from, that'll be a real big deal. Another constellation, has anyone been to Jamestown, New York? It's about an hour and a half outside of Buffalo. It's also quite near the Chautauqua Institute, which allows it to be part of this constellation. It was a rail town, and along the river and harvesting the wood in the region was very strong for a long, long time. It's on Lake Chautauqua, which is very, very picturesque. It's not on Lake Erie, but it's or Lake Ontario. It's south of that. But like a lot of these smaller municipalities, when they were growing, when they were wealthy, there's evidence of that throughout this small town. This is Jamestown is about 28,000 people. And the first thing that the town did is actually they harnessed all of these legacy philanthropic organizations to just reinvest in the facades that were falling down, just preserve them rather than tearing them down. Thought about concentrating redevelopment, so they smaller towns need to really direct resources so they don't get spread out too thin. And in Jamestown, it was about let's focus right along the river and around the buildings and Main Street that are right in that center. So resisting the urge to sort of tackle whatever is as needed and really focus that in a smaller geography. They also, the image on the upper right, your right, is the old train station that was a ruin and about to be demolished. Well, they have turned that little rail station into, get this, a national comedy center. And I'll tell you, this is the most, yes, Lucille Ball was born in Jamestown, New York, as was one of the Supreme Court justices and the ornithologist who, for birding. They did a book on birds, whose name I can't recall. So they preserve that building. It's the most interactive museum I've ever been in. When you first walk in, you're given a little bracelet, and it asks you what you find funny. And as you go along in the different exhibits, it'll tailor the humor to things that you find funny because you sort of respond about whether this was helpful or not. And by the end of the hour and a half or 2-hour tour, it's really remarkable. So it's very high tech in this smaller town. It's also a curiosity to me that small towns can have an outsized impact in terms of tourism. So this is a little hard to read, but Corning, New York has a population of 10,000, but the Museum of Glass, which has many...
Awesome. One of the best museums I've ever been to.
Why do you say that?
The way it was laid out, the explaining, the curating, I walked out, I was just stunned with the whole experience, and I'm not a science person.
And it brings 400,000 people. Cooperstown, 1,800 people, 300,000 annually because of the Baseball Hall of Fame. Bentonville, Arkansas, with Crystal Bridges, you mentioned that, again, nearly 400,000 people. So visitors per capita, small town versus big town. Here in Jamestown, they're only getting 65,000 at this National Comedy Center, but for a town of 28,000, that's pretty good. Here's North Adams. So you don't have to be big to actually have a major destination. The last one in the series is Bentonville, Arkansas. And it's in the constellations because it's not just Bentonville. It's actually Rogers and Springdale, who also have Fortune 500 companies there. J.B. Hunt, Tyson's Foods, in addition to Walmart headquarters. This is the Crystal Bridges Museum. And so the Northwest Arkansas, in order to attract the next generation of knowledge workers, has rebranded itself as this pretty cool, funky place, complete with major bike trails that run through these different towns. And so the Walton Family Foundation, which still has 3 of the richest people in the world live there, they have created this network of bike trails that's now a destination from across the world. People coming here to ride these mountain bike trails, and even the buildings that are emerging along the trails, you bike up that building, in fact. And so it's really raised the profile of what is otherwise a fairly poor state to become a really interesting destination. And they've done that also through design excellence. There's a design excellence program that the Walton Family Foundation has set up that's attracting designers and planners from landscape architects from all across the country. So it's a competitive process that brings in high design talent. They finance that, they support it, and you're getting remarkable first-class, world-class buildings to come to that corner of this state. You might also say, well, that's interesting because Walmart is frequently demonized as killing the small town. And yet here, they're doing what they can to try to make this region more impactful than it currently is. A couple more. Satellites. Small towns that are kind of in the orbit. Piqua was one of those. That's near Dayton. Columbus is booming. But in Caldwell, we were curious about, I read in the sidebar of this book called World by Design. There's a little sidebar about this small town near Boise that daylit a stream through its downtown. Has anyone been to Caldwell, Idaho? They also have a big rodeo. But this is like a remarkable effort for a small town. Let's see, Caldwell is 60,000, so it's on the upper end. They've also grown a lot because Idaho is growing so much. But this is a town that was covered over, channelized. There was a culvert that covered over the stream. And over the course of 25 years with one mayor, they've been able to systematically acquire properties and daylight the stream, which has huge environmental impacts. It's now a major destination. Boise is one of the fastest growing cities and one of the fastest growing states. Caldwell is 30 minutes from Boise, but it was a pretty poor town for most of its existence. It was also a rail town. You can see the remnants of the rail. So this little green ribbon, this blue ribbon, has actually, again, reoriented this small town towards this natural water body. And I thought the case was about that, and then I go there and I realize that this is also where Simplot's headquarters are. Simplot franchises all of the French fries to Burger King and McDonald's across the world. It's like Idaho royalty. And who's working in the agricultural fields? Well, it's a lot of migrant workers who come from Mexico to work the fields in the farming industry. So there's this really interesting tension between a state which is 80%, 95% white, and of that 75% Mormon, and then this huge influx of Mexican culture that's also trying to sort of assert itself or even be recognized. That was just like an interesting juxtaposition of the town square and then kind of the low rider in the neighborhood adjacent to it. And I had my best Mexican meal with Sal and his wife, who opened up a high-end restaurant in an old bank building along their main street because they didn't feel that there was enough kind of local flavor and culture there to capitalize on that. So they've programmed the heck out of this open space. It's Festival of Lights. It's brought a lot of people into this small town that, but for this intervention, I think would still be striving to overcome its legacy of decay. A couple more metro posts, small towns within a major metro area. San Ysidro is right on the border of Mexico. I don't know, has anyone been there? You have? When were you there?
Just this past summer.
Why?
We were in San Diego for a week, and so we took the San Diego trolley down to San Ysidro to cross the border to Tijuana.
Yes. Yeah, so that's the border of Tijuana, right? And there is a metro line that got extended to right at that gate. The largest port of entry in the country is right here. And there are 60,000 cars a day, but there's also 20,000 pedestrians that cross back and forth. So the port of entry is $1 billion investment by the federal government to improve the connections between Mexico and the United States. This was a long-term investment. And so you've got thousands and thousands of idling cars every day crossing through this port of entry. adjacent to San Ysidro, which is in the metropolitan area of San Diego, but very, very poor. And so there's this paradox of a major infrastructure investment here, the economy crossing both ways, but also a small town that's struggling to deal with the adverse effects of that environmental reality. And so the case actually isn't so much about this major port of entry, but rather a very small, nimble nonprofit called Casa Familiar that has been systematically, I would say even surgically redeveloping a neighborhood with very specific programs that are geared towards people that are coming across the border. And it's hard to see in this image, but they've also done it in a very contemporary fashion. So the architects, Fona Foreman and Teddy Cruz, have created this little collection of buildings that are based upon a sense of paseos, which are the passages in the neighborhood, and they've done it in a very kind of compelling way. That's Lisa, who is the nonprofit executive director. And, to your point, because this is in the orbit of San Diego, which is also rapidly expanding, and because now there's a transit line that connects all the way to Tijuana, you're getting immense pressure for transit-oriented development that is threatening this kind of small community. And so again, it's a bit of a struggle about how to capitalize on the transit connection, but also recognize that affordability in this region is a real challenge. And so this small nonprofit is doing what they can to reconcile those two dilemmas. And the last case is outposts. Has anyone been to Traverse City, Michigan? I wouldn't be surprised. The case in Traverse City is about the reuse of an old asylum. And I worked on one of these in Buffalo, New York, which is why I traveled to Traverse City, because over the course of, again, 30 years, and that is an undercurrent of all of these projects, as people think it just happened right away, it's almost always decades of effort on the part of many people across sectors actually to tee these projects up to completion. This is a single developer that has worked diligently. He's also a contractor, which helps to reuse this former asylum into the most diverse set of housing I've experienced in one complex. This is what it looked like in the mid-19th century. A very inspired psychiatrist thought about dealing with people with mental illness in an inspired fashion. And that's what it looks like here. Danvers, if you've ever seen, has portions of what was an asylum and is now luxury housing or market rate housing. And in Traverse City, you've got this 600,000 square foot building that's been divvied up into all kinds of housing. They've now spurred other uses around it, including event venues, and that's a shot of one of the apartments. And they've been able miraculously to create affordable housing, market rate housing, senior housing, a lot of Airbnbs now too. And so they've been slowly building on the investments to try to reposition this major building into other uses. And even today, there's still portions of this complex that are yet to be redeveloped. And lastly, and what's on the cover of the book is in Greensburg, Kansas. And in 2007, this small municipality of 1,500 people was decimated by a Category 5 tornado, which is the highest ever recorded. In fact, the diameter of the tornado was larger than the town itself. 95% of this town was obliterated from a Category 5 tornado. This is in Kansas along, Tornado Alley. And in this before and after image, you can just see the tornado actually grew. It gained in intensity over the town for over 3 minutes. It's quite a sad story. But what's inspiring about it, and this is in a small town in what I would describe as a red state, a conservative-minded state, they have redeveloped their downtown in the most sustainable fashion that I've ever seen in any municipality of any size. Every streetscape is resilient with grasses and water gardens, and every building is what's called LEED Platinum, which is the highest standard for a building of environmental sustainability. That's required at any public building. That's their town hall. And so there's this fascinating sensitivity of the region, who are mostly farmers, recognizing that how to care for the land and thinking about its relationship to the town itself really needs to be done in a sensitive fashion. And most poetic, they have leveraged the wind to now contribute more energy back to the grid than they use. So every case has this little information graphic, and in this instance, so 99% of the wind in the region versus in the state, it's about half. In the United States, 10% of our energy is wind. So they're actually giving back to the region the thing that actually decimated them. And so, these trends about the rise of remote work, kind of affordability, density, walkability, historic preservation, they are coalescing at this moment, I think, in kind of the national discourse about flyover states versus the coast, et cetera. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting things happening, even in smaller municipalities, perhaps because they're small and the networks between people are tighter, that allow them to transform and change. And I think it's a fascinating time to be working across scales, but also I'm optimistic that smaller towns, even like Sudbury, can find ways to celebrate things that allowed it to grow initially and also look into the future. Thanks.